By now we know that the fall of the Roman Empire is a very complicated topic where we cannot pinpoint one single big cause for its fall. It was an extremely long and complicated process that stretched over 1,000 years, ending with the fall of the last Roman states after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and beginning 1,000 years earlier with the dissolution of the western half of the Roman Empire. The why of the fall is already a complicated question, but what about the when? When did things start to go wrong in the Roman Empire? When did the economic, governmental, administrative and military system of the Roman Empire start massively going south for the first time? Well, friends of Roman history, I hope I can convince you that this is earlier than most people think. It is quite fascinating how a construct such as the Roman Empire could endure for so many years, despite all the problems it had. It is absolutely astounding to realize that from the founding of the city of Rome in 753 BC until the fall of Constantinople and the last Byzantine rump states, there is a time span of more than 2,200 years. The fall of the Roman Empire happened in multiple big invasion waves, about which I will make a detailed future video. But already during the crisis of the 3rd century, it became very apparent that the Roman Empire had deeper underlying problems than many had thought possible, and it was also very apparent that the Imperium Romanum was a very fragile construct. However, even the crisis of the 3rd century was not the first time when things started to go wrong on a massive scale. And it all started with a pandemic. In 165 AD, a pathogen was brought into the Roman Empire, possibly spread during the siege of Seleucia in the invasion of Mesopotamia in the winter of late 165 and early 166. The virus could spread quickly over the highly developed and interconnected Roman road network and was further spread via the Roman bathing culture. We can see that the first thing that caused big problems for the Roman Empire were diseases. This would be only the first big pandemic of the empire. Others were to follow, and a combination of highly developed roads, the bathing culture, and a complete lack of understanding of pathogens would be already a big contributing factor to the fall of the Roman Empire. It's an irony of history that the desire for hygiene, which manifested in the bathing culture, would actually help to spread the deadliest diseases. Possibly around 10% of the empire's population was killed in this pandemic, and this would consequently, of course, weaken the military, in whose ranks the virus rampaged with especially high aggression. It was during those times that for the first time ever, 2 emperors reigned co-jointly, namely the famous Marcus Aurelius and his adoptive brother Lucius Verus. They were the 2 Antonines, and hence the plague carries their name. And it was already so early, in 162 AD, that several Germanic tribes began to overrun the border defenses in Raetia and Germania Superior. Among those tribes were the Chatti and the Chauci. They were repulsed, but in late 166 or early 167, a force of Langobardi and Lacringi managed to invade Pannonia. Even though the plague was already ravaging by that time, this attack too could be repulsed. But in 167, the Vandals, yes, they already appear so early, and the Sarmatian Yasugis managed to invade Dacia, even managing to kill the governor of that province. But the biggest disaster was the invasion of the Marcomanni. They managed together with the Quadi to break through the border defenses and venture deep into the empire, even sacking and destroying some cities along their way, such as for instance the city of Opitergium, which was completely destroyed. For the first time in 270 years did barbarians manage to even threaten Italy itself. In 168 or 169, Aquileia itself was besieged. But since the plague was raging, a military counteroffensive could not be mounted fast and easily, and 2 new Italic legions had to be recruited. Fascinatingly, already now, Marcus was forced to recruit slaves, gladiators, and even criminals because of a severe lack of recruits due to the plague. This reminds us of Stilicho repeating the exact same measures 232 years later during the invasions of Alaric and Radagaisus. Only with great difficulty could the Marcomanni and Quadi be driven back, and Lucius Verus himself died in early 169, very likely killed by the virus. In 170 then, another tribe, the Kostoboki, crossed the Danube, ravaged in Thrace, sacked and plundered in their way, and even managed to get as far south as Eleusis near Athens. This was when Eleusis was sacked and the temple of the Eleusinian mysteries was burned to the ground by the invaders. It is quite brutal to find that already so early in Roman history, such terrible events could transpire in the previously invincible seeming Imperium Romanum. And if you are a Rome nerd like me, and chances are pretty high that you are if you are watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can get a 10% rebate on every purchase if you type in the rebate code Maiorianus. So go and check out their assortment, it's really quite incredible. So back to this crisis of the 2nd century, as I like to call it. These events were, as we now know, but a taste of things to come later in the 3rd and especially 5th centuries. The Germanic invaders were driven out of the empire again in the subsequent years, often by recruiting new men into the Roman legions. In those days, the Roman currency was still strong. The debasement of the monetary system had not yet reached dangerous levels. But this crisis would mark the turning point. The Antonine Plague, killing so many people, led to a severe drop of gold and silver output from the imperial mines, such as from the famous one in the Las Medullas mountains in Spain, where entire mountains were washed away for gold. So because the output of gold and silver dropped, already Marcus Aurelius was forced to start debasing the currency more, in order to keep the pay for the soldiers in these times of utter crisis high. Because when you need many new recruits, you sure want to keep the army happy and the incentives for joining the legions high. But as we now know, this very practice would get more and more out of hand in later decades and would lead to the huge crises later on. I made a video in which I talked about what an important role the debasement of the Roman currency in order to pay the huge army played in the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman counteroffensive came then in 172 AD, when Marcus had the legions cross over the Danube River into Germanic territory and defeat the Marcomanni, an undertaking which was successful, forcing the Marcomanni to sign a peace treaty. Next, a campaign was started against the Quadi and the Yasugi in 173 and 175 respectively. Both were defeated, a peace treaty was signed, forcing many barbarians to join the Roman army as foederati, a practice which we would see later far more often, until almost 300 years later there would be only barbarian mercenaries and no regular army anymore, at least in the West. And this already started on a large scale in the Marcomannic Wars. Marcus wanted to establish two new Roman Trans-Danubian provinces, namely Marcomannia and Sarmatia. But before that could happen, Avidius Cassius, a general in the province of Syria, rebelled. So Marcus had to give up his plans of establishing these new provinces and marched east. But before he could arrive in Syria, Cassius had already been killed, failing to gather enough support for his rebellion, especially from Egypt. Yet still, this rebellion came at the worst possible time, before the war against the Germanic tribes was brought to a satisfactory conclusion. In 176 AD, Marcus elevated his son Commodus to Caesar, making him his co-ruler. A decision that, as we know in hindsight, would prove disastrous for the Roman Empire. He returned to Rome that same year, a triumph was held, and his victories against the Germanic invaders was commemorated on the famous column of Marcus Aurelius. But in 177 already, the Marcomanni and Quadi rebelled again, forcing Marcus to return to the frontier, where between 178 and 180 the Romans again won important victories against these Germanic tribes. Unfortunately though, in March of the year 180, Marcus Aurelius died. This noble ruler, possibly the best emperor Rome ever had, a stoic philosopher on the emperor's throne, forced to face the worst of times in the existence of the Roman Empire since it was established 200 years earlier by Augustus. It is very unfortunate that Commodus did not have the character traits of his father. Fascinatingly, there is at least some grain of truth to the movie Gladiator in that the character of Maximus Decimus Meridius was partially based on Marcus's general Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus. This general, who won many victories for Marcus against the barbarian tribes, was even nominated to become Roman emperor by Marcus after the death of Lucius Verus. But Pompeianus declined. And so basically Marcus was forced to name a successor, and since Commodus was his only surviving son, all others having been taken by the plague, he had no other choice than to name Commodus his successor, lest the empire might be plunged into civil war. It is fascinating to think about what would have happened had Pompeianus accepted to become co-emperor of Marcus Aurelius. I think history would have gone very differently under his rule. As a close friend of Marcus, he knew how important it was to bring the war to a satisfactory conclusion. Instead of becoming co-emperor, Pompeianus was made chief general of the northern legions and Marcus's closest advisor. After Aurelius's death, Pompeianus tried to persuade Commodus to continue the war against the northern tribes, but Commodus was not interested in such things. He left for Rome already that same year in 180 AD, and the rest is history. A large sum was paid to the Germanic tribes and the peace was basically bought, although there is some evidence that the legionary commanders continued to campaign against the Germanic tribes in the early years of Commodus's rule until around 182 AD. This apparently was enough for Commodus to call himself Germanicus. Yet, this sent a dangerous signal to Rome's enemies, namely that invading the empire worked better than expected, and that Rome was weaker than many had thought, and it signaled that Rome was forced to buy peace. We can be very sure that these news spread like wildfire among the Germanic tribes beyond the Roman borders, stories that were kept alive for many generations to come, so that 100, 200 and 300 years later, the Germanic tribes knew very well that Rome was not invincible and that invading the empire and demanding ransom was a strategy that actually worked, especially in times when Rome was weakened. Further, Commodus debased the Roman currency even more to buy the allegiance of the army, thus exacerbating this dangerous trend even more, which would directly lead to the crisis of the 3rd century. And lastly, Commodus's tyrannic rule would dangerously weaken the respect for the position of Roman emperor. While the whole Roman Empire mourned the loss of Marcus Aurelius, who was universally beloved by the entire population, nobody mourned Commodus, and his death led directly to civil wars, which would set a dangerous precedent, namely that succession disputes could indeed be won by military force. Thus, the Pax Romana really had come to an end, and it was the events of the 160s where it all started going wrong for the Roman Empire. A brutal plague that killed millions, barbarian invasions that saw entire cities destroyed and even threatened Italy for the first time in 270 years, rebellions of usurpers that forced military action, debasement of the Roman currency and a drop of output from the imperial gold and silver mines, a destabilization and reduced respect for the position of emperor, civil wars. We can thus see that if we would have to pinpoint where exactly things started to go very wrong for the Roman Empire, it is earlier than even the crisis of the 3rd century. We could actually call this the crisis of the 2nd century. While not quite as brutal as the later crises, it already laid bare the fundamental flaws of the Imperium Romanum. There was no real defense strategy against the Germanic tribes, only one line of defense, and if that line was broken, the tribes could sack and destroy everything in their path for a long time until an effective military counter-strike could be formed. It also showed the lack of an imperial succession system and also showed the flawed economy of the empire that needed constant gold and silver output either from mines or through conquering. It also showed how easily the empire could be weakened by pandemics. Thus, for me, it all started going south already in the 160s AD. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. This channel would not work without our amazing Patreon and YouTube members, and I really want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form, be it Patreon, YouTube membership or PayPal donations. Thank you so much, friends. Gratias tibiago, amici. And if you want to learn more about why the debasement of the Roman currency in order to satisfy the huge Roman army was so dangerous, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested to learn how the Germanic tribes managed to breach the western border defenses for good 230 years after Marcus Aurelius, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.